ほら、ルフィ、今一緒に海賊になる仲間を探してるんだ。
Hello guys, welcome to my channel The Wandering Zoro, your go-to destination for anime-related content. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest videos. In today's video, we're going to be diving into part 1 of the series What If Quirkless Izuku chooses to become a vigilante instead of a hero. So be sure to stick around until the end, and let's get started. Izuku shut the door behind him as he entered his home. He had just gotten back home from school, but the sky had turned dark. He was out for far longer than he was expecting, and now his mother wasn't home. Izuku sighed. His phone was still clutched in his hands from him texting his mother the reason for his late arrival home. She had been spamming him messages and constantly calling him, worried about her son's whereabouts. Izuku had texted her that there was a villain fight, and he stuck around to see the result. However, that was not the case. Izuku walked towards the shower, as he still felt slimy from the events that transpired that day. The lie Izuku told his mother wasn't technically wrong, but he still felt bad that he was withholding information from her. But if Izuku had told her everything that happened today, she'd lose her mind and lock Izuku up in a cocoon of blankets until the rapture came about. The day had also started off great for Izuku today, giving him false hope, which Izuku didn't find funny. On his walk towards school, Izuku witnessed a villain with a gigantification quirk try to avoid capture after robbing several stores. Izuku got to see an up-and-coming hero that was suspected to reach the top 10 rank within the next year, Kimui Woods. Izuku was amazed as he got to watch Kimui Woods easily distract the villain and wear them down. Just before Kimui Woods was to unleash his signature move, a new hero made their debut that day. A hero with a gigantification quirk of her own arrived on the scene, and Mount Lady certainly made an impact. Izuku was stunned to have witnessed the fight, and he rapidly scribbled words into his hero analyses notebook. Izuku had always been a hero nerd, and his hobby is to analyze an array of unique quirks of heroes to see how they use them to fight. Izuku hoped that his extensive research would help the teen one day become a hero of his own. If he, a quirkless child, knew how to fight against all kinds of quirks, he may have a chance of being a pro hero. But that was where everything went downhill for the rest of the day, as Izuku finally reached school. Izuku put his hand on the door to the bathroom, but suddenly started a coughing fit. His throat was still sore from what had happened. It felt dry and flaky, as if he swallowed hay. The coughing fit lasted around 10 seconds, and by the end of it, Izuku's face was beet red, and he'd likely have tears if he had any left to shed. The halls of Aldera Middle School was not kind to people with weak or villainous quirks. Most of them cower in the toilets. But they were thankful they weren't as unfortunate to be born as a quirkless freak like Izuku Midoriya. Izuku went through his usual routine of taking vile insults as he walked, people throwing objects at his head or pushing him down on the floor for fun. This kind of treatment was what Izuku has been suffering through since he entered primary school at 6 years old. At this point, nothing unusual had happened to Izuku. If anything, he had gotten lucky with the physical violence today, and Izuku counted that as a win. But when his last period teacher walked into the room, Izuku felt his stomach squirm intolerably and the hairs on his neck stand sharp. Once Izuku noticed the sick grin he gave Izuku upon entering. Izuku was afraid of that teacher, mostly because he loved making Izuku, the quirkless loser, miserable. His way of doing that was to antagonize Aldera's prize student, Katsuki Bakugo. Izuku and Katsuki were once friends. Before they were old enough to develop their quirks, Izuku and Katsuki were inseparable. Izuku called his friend Kachin, a nickname he gave the boy because it was easier to say his actual name. Now it was something Katsuki despised, and he would violently lash out at Izuku if he called him that. However, Izuku couldn't bring himself to stop. It was the one reminder he had that he once had a friend, because since it was declared that he was quirkless, no one wanted to be associated with the quirkless freak. Not that Izuku blamed them. Who would want to be friends with a pathetic loser such as himself? His teacher started the class off by stating that they needed to think about their future careers. But instead of handing out the necessary forms, he just threw the papers in the air and shouted that it didn't matter, they all wanted to become heroes anyway. This created an uproar in the classroom, and many people activated their quirks. Izuku ducked his head at the loud noise. He was comfortable with that volume. It made him feel like they were about to gang up on him. "Ah, shut up. You shits are annoying. You'd all be lucky to end up as some sidekick to a D-lister," Katsuki said, smiling smugly at the other students who turned to look at him. Izuku flinched at the blonde's voice. He didn't dare turn his head. He annoyed Katsuki by just looking at him, and he didn't want to upset the closest thing he had to a friend. The class rebutted Katsuki's insult, but they immediately shut up once the blonde jumped on his desk. Izuku forced his head to stay down, hoping to not attract any attention. Katsuki laughed as he looked around the class, and he lit some explosions in his palms which made Izuku involuntarily tense up. "Listen here, I am in a whole different league than all of you. I'll be the only one from this shitty school to get into UA, and I'll become the next #1 hero," Katsuki shouted proudly. Izuku began to hear the whispers around the class. People were talking about Katsuki trying for UA, the rumors of the prestigious school's 2% acceptance rate floated about, and a couple of students whispered that if anyone could do it, it would be Katsuki. "Yes, you are tying for UA, aren't you, Bakugo? Oh, and Midoriya, you are also throwing your hat in for UA too," the teacher stated out loud, catching everyone's attention. Izuku's eyes widened in fear as he looked up to see the smug smile of his teacher. Beads of sweat fell down from Izuku's head as he felt the lasers of an angry glare, burning the side of his head. He didn't dare look. Izuku pushed the door to the bathroom open and reached up to his shoulder. The fabric of his uniform was singed, and loose strands stood up like hairs on Izuku's shoulder. Carefully, Izuku unbuttoned his shirt and slowly peeled his uniform off. The boy winced and hissed as the removal of the slight pressure his uniform had on his burn resulted in searing pain. Izuku hardly remembered the events that caused his scar on his shoulder. It was a blur. Izuku has read somewhere that memory is foggy in cases of people having intense fear. The main thing that sticks in their mind is when their sheer panic is at the highest. This is something that Izuku believes is true and has experienced himself. Izuku doesn't remember hearing the bell, but knows he was cornered when class was ended. Katsuki menacingly stalked over to Izuku with his two cronies behind him, effectively securing Izuku in the room. Izuku can remember watching their mouths move, but not what they said. The only thing he could hear was his own mind shouting, "Please don't hurt me. Please don't hurt me. Please don't hurt me." Izuku froze in terror when he noticed Katsuki lean down to him. He used his nitroglycerin sweat his quirk produces and superheated his palm, where his explosions are produced. Bits of burned fabric was now melted into Izuku's skin at his left shoulder. Afterwards, Izuku could only watch as Katsuki blew up his precious future hero analyses book, number 13, before throwing it out the window of the classroom. When Izuku had later retrieved, it was unsalvable, burned and wet. Most of the ink was smeared and majority of the pages were falling apart, so Izuku later threw it in the bin. But what stabbed Izuku in the heart were the cruel words Katsuki said to him. The laughter of his lackeys never reached Izuku's eyes as his mind became a cave. The echo of Katsuki's words started bouncing in his mind, and somewhere inside, laughing at the back of his brain agreed with those brutish words. "If you want a quirk that badly, jump off the roof and pray for one in your next life." It should have hardly been a surprise for Izuku. He can't blame Katsuki for hating him that much that he'd like for Izuku to himself. But Izuku still felt himself shatter at those words. He stuck to Katsuki like glue, even after the boy shouted, hit, and exploded Izuku for following him. But Izuku felt like he had to. Katsuki was the closest thing to normal Izuku had. Katsuki was one of the three grounding things Izuku always had. Katsuki was one, then Izuku's mother, and finally, heroes. Izuku doesn't know how to cope if one of those things were to suddenly disappear from his life. They were his one sense of normalcy. Izuku had that made himself useful. Izuku lied to his mother, putting on a fake smile to ease her worries to make her happy. Inko Midoriya had always been a worry wart, something that got worse when Izuku's father left. Izuku felt responsible for it. If he had a quirk like a normal person, his father would still be here and his mother would still be happy. Yet he was a defected child which his mother still had the heart to love. Heroes was a constant in the world. They were advertised everywhere and symbolized as the pinnacles of justice and safety for citizens in every country. Izuku was like every young kid, in love with the idea that they too could one day become a hero. However, no other kid was as enthralled by heroes as much as Izuku. The boy would slave away at videos, looking at their quirks, how they used them, their fighting style, then would proceed to mimic them, so he could learn these techniques when he tried to become a hero. But then Izuku was announced quirkless, and his dream of being hero now became laughable. Izuku agreed. Him being a hero was just as likely as alien life to be discovered. However, Izuku couldn't give up. It felt wrong if he stopped his dream of being a hero. It was as if it was in his genes to need to try. It was why he followed Katsuki like a lost puppy for all these years. Katsuki was going to be a hero, and a good one at that. You were blind to not see the boy's potential. Izuku was desperate to have a semblance of heroism, so if he could help an old friend achieve his dream, Izuku would happily be his punching bag. Day after day, Izuku sought out Katsuki, telling the boys his ideas for support items, super moves, and new ways he could use his quirk. Izuku willingly took the beating from Katsuki, acting as the explosion boy's test dummy. Izuku was fine with it. He was annoying Katsuki. It was his fault for Katsuki's outbursts. It was only fair that Izuku gets punished for it. So, when Izuku yelled those hurtful words that day, Izuku felt disheartened. He had really hoped Katsuki had found some use out of Izuku's stupid rambles he called advice. Izuku felt disappointed as he understood that he may have just been a hindrance to Katsuki, despite how hard he tried to help. Izuku removed his pants, only using his right arm, as his left shoulder stung with pain from the burn. Izuku stood up and turned to look at himself in the mirror. Izuku could only hate how he looked. He was skinny, short, and hideous. His green hair could not be tamed. His eyes were large and childlike. His freckles were ugly dots covering his face, and Izuku couldn't help but gag at his crooked and weak smile. Izuku had always wanted the ability to disappear, and when he was walking out from school, his need to just fade from reality had never been as strong. The words from Katsuki just minutes ago still bounded in Izuku's head as he trudged home with his head held down. He had chucked his 13th analyses book in the bin, and the pain from his shoulder was still nagging him. Izuku didn't think he could feel worse. As the boy moped, he accidentally made a wrong turn. It wasn't until a large shadow moved overhead of Izuku did the boy finally look up. Izuku couldn't see the sky. Instead, his eyes saw a dull gray ceiling. Izuku scrunched his eyes and discovered that it was stone. Izuku had walked underneath a bridge. Izuku sighed and slapped his face with his palm and mentally berated himself for his idiocy. Izuku turned around, intending to get back in the right way home. However, the manhole cover that he was just about to step out shifted and shot out. Izuku yelled in fright. The boy tripped from the sudden movement and fell down. Izuku's eyes widened as he looked towards the open sewer hole. What Izuku noticed first was the diabolic odor from the sewer, and it just got worse as an acid-like sludge sloppily pulled itself up from the hole. Izuku opened the glass door his shower had before slowly closing it behind him. He could still feel the sludge villain's residue on his skin and especially in his hair. Izuku fancied a shower, and he gave a contempt sigh as the rush of cold water thrashed around his warm skin. He kept his burn wound out of the water to start as he knew it would be extremely painful in a second. You'd make a perfect meat suit kid. I'd suggest you try not to struggle, he remembered the villain saying, but his main focus at the time was survival. The villain lunged forward at Izuku before he could even act. Disgusting green sludge coiled around his limbs, then torso, then head. Izuku shudders when he remembers the feeling of the sludge from the villain being forcibly shoved down his throat. Izuku cleaned himself, spending a longer than needed time at his throat since he still felt lingering bits of the villain at that area. No matter how hard he scrubbed, his throat still felt as if the slime villain was suffocating him. Izuku soon turned off the water. He continued to stand inside of his shower, unmoving as his thoughts were still jumbled. Eventually, Izuku forced himself out of the shower, stepping onto the bathroom mat. Izuku grabbed a towel and rubbed it across his body to dry himself off. He avoided his burn. He only gently wetted in the shower and didn't feel like agitating the wound again. Izuku then curled the towel around his waist to help it stay in place. Izuku then bent down and grabbed his discarded uniform. Izuku had to wash it himself as he knows his mother would freak out at the burned hole in his shoulder. Izuku didn't want to make her worried and have to explain what happened. He didn't want to snitch on Katsuki. It was his fault that he made the teen attack him. But Izuku would wait until tomorrow to put his uniform in the laundry. It was the weekend, so there was no rush. Izuku slowly trod out of the bathroom and moved towards his room. Izuku saw the silver name plate on his door, his name etched onto it by a laser. Izuku couldn't remember a time where that name plate wasn't on his door. It didn't need to be there. It was just him and his mom, but Izuku couldn't bring himself to remove it. Izuku opened the door to his room and immediately froze. Around his room was layers of hero merchandise, posters, action figures galore was the only thing Izuku could see. But Izuku's eyes had immediately veered towards the large poster above his bed. It was an image of his favorite heroes with large bold words underneath them. "You too can be a hero," the poster stated. "The man is Japan's #1 hero, All Might." Izuku had always idolized the man. He was the greatest hero the world had ever seen. He never failed to save the day, and he always did it with a smile. Izuku wanted to be like All Might, to have his very presence install safety in civilians. Izuku wanted the privilege to meet the man himself, and through today's twisted form of events, Izuku was questioning whether wanting to meet All Might was really a good idea. The sludge villain had rendered Izuku unconscious as Izuku gave up his struggle for life. He didn't expect to still be alive, so when he cracked his eyes open to see All Might staring down at him, Izuku had believed he was dead. It took All Might slapping him a few more times did Izuku understand that he was not in fact dead and was staring at All Might himself. Izuku was in shock, so much so that he failed to utter a single word. All Might laughed heartily at Izuku, which made the boy lower his head, believing the hero was making fun of him. Izuku's eyes widened into saucers when All Might handed a piece of paper with his signature on it. Izuku snatched it in his hands, and a large smile overtook Izuku's face, and the fact he was almost dead moments ago was forgotten. "Ha ha ha, you're welcome, young man. But I do need to go. This villain needs to be taken into the police," All Might declared loudly. Izuku looked up to All Might, but the hero had already turned his back to him. Izuku felt disappointment well inside of him. He had his idol right in front of him, yet he had just made himself look like a fool. This was his one opportunity to talk to the hero. A question then popped into Izuku's head, a question that he had been dying to know since he was diagnosed quirkless. Can someone quirkless ever hope to one day become a pro hero? It was something Izuku wanted. No, he needed to know the answer to his question from the greatest hero in Japan. "Wait," Izuku yelled to All Might. The boy found his feet and managed to stand tall. However, All Might did not turn around. He just continued to walk away, get out from beneath the bridge. "Wait," Izuku yelled again, but All Might did not listen. Instead, he squatted down and prepared himself to jump. Izuku gritted his teeth and desperation filled him, and he did something that Izuku now regrets and beats himself up for. He dashed forward and grabbed All Might's leg. The hero didn't notice, and he jumped into the air. Izuku screamed and clung on for dear life as he moved faster than he ever had before. All Might had tried to shake him off, but stopped when he realized the kid would fall to his death. All Might changed his trajectory midair and safely landed on top of a building. Once Izuku could feel the ground with his feet, he promptly let go of All Might. Izuku gasped and fell to his knees, clutching his chest to calm his rapid heartbeat. Izuku breathed heavily. The rush from the wind made his body shake uncontrollably with fear as the prospect of death returned to him once more. He was only able to bring himself out of his state of terror when he heard violent coughing. Turning his head, Izuku couldn't believe what he saw. The pinnacle of greatness and fitness himself, who inspired hope and safety into all the hearts of children across Japan, just became a skeleton of a man right before Izuku's eyes. Izuku was in shock at what he had just saw, but that shock was quickly replaced with horror as the man started coughing up fluids. Izuku quickly went up to the exhausted hero in worry of his help, but he insisted that he was fine. They talked for a bit, with Izuku learning about a serious injury for All Might's time limit. But Izuku still wanted to ask a question that had been plaguing his mind to ask his hero since he was 4. With that specific age, you would obviously be able to guess the question Izuku wants to ask the man. Could someone without a quirk ever hope of becoming a hero? So Izuku asked him, hoping for confirmation, for the belief and positivity of someone to say yes, that his dream is obtainable, that he was not worthless, that he could be like him. "No, I'm sorry, kid. It's good to have dreams, but you have to be realistic," All Might had answered without hesitation, stating that it was okay for Izuku to have dreams, but always have those dreams to be obtainable. But Izuku was barely listening. Not even his hero, his idol, arguably the person who kept him smiling from day to day, didn't believe in him. Even with him saying that anyone could be a hero. Guess quirkless people don't count as human. The man had told Izuku to knock on the door and wait for someone to come and get him. But Izuku watched the tired hero open the door himself and slam it behind him. That had made Izuku flinch and shiver. All Might was mad. Why? Was it because his time was wasted because Izuku was quirkless? Was it that much of a sin to not be born with a quirk? After a while of crying, Izuku forced himself up. He looked down at the crowd and studied the passers-by. All of them, completely unaware of the broken boy looking down at them from above. Previous words from that day came back to Izuku's head. If you want a quirk that badly, jump off the roof and pray for one in your next life. Izuku shuddered at the memory and knocked his head with his hand. Izuku gritted his teeth and shook his head, forcing that bad memory out of his head. Izuku sighed and chucked his uniform to the corner of his room. He'd stitch the hole back up later. After this eventful day, Izuku just wanted to go to sleep. He had to admit, he felt the urge to actually follow through with Katsuki's advice. But those dark voices that lurked in the corners of his head laughed at how pathetic he was, saying that his one solution to have a chance of success at life was to restart. Tears stung Izuku's eyes, but like the coward he was, he backed down from the ledge. He told himself he couldn't do that to his mother, that she'd feel like she failed him, but the dark voices kept on reminding him that he was just too scared to jump. Izuku walked over to his closet and grabbed a pair of shorts and a shirt. He folded up his towel and placed it on his desk before flinging his new clothes on. Izuku grunted as the new fabric touched his burn. Izuku paused for a second before throwing his shirt off. He quickly ran over to his desk where a small cabinet sat underneath it. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a large white box and opened it, revealing a medical kit. Izuku commonly used this kit, as this wasn't the first time Katsuki had burned him. Izuku was used to the procedure he needed to help heal his burns and applied the petroleum jelly he stashed inside. He hid the kit from his mother as he didn't want her to ask questions and become worried. Once done, Izuku wrapped bandages around his left shoulder to cover the burn. Izuku then put all of the items he used back in the box and put it away. Izuku looked towards the clothes he was about to put on the side before diving onto his bed. He chucked the covers over him and smashed his head into his pillow and squeezed his eyes shut. Izuku just wanted to forget about this crappy day and hide out in his room for as long as possible. He wanted to remove the memory of upsetting Katsuki and forget his meeting with All Might he had today. But there was one good thing that happened to Izuku today, and now had found the boy smiling in his bed of comfort. Izuku sighed as he reached the bottom of the building All Might left him on and walked into the street. When he left the building, he had his head held down, but he quickly jerked it up upon hearing an explosion rung in his ears. Izuku flinched and instinctively ducked down. Those loud bangs reminded Izuku of explosions. Katsuki's explosions. A few more pops could be heard, and it wasn't until Izuku saw people running in the direction of the sound of the explosions that he realized that it was a hero fight. Izuku, never one to back down on analyzing the quirks of heroes, rushed over to the scene, even in his state of misery. Thanks to Izuku's small stature, he easily weaseled his way through the crowd of people. Izuku easily made his way to the front, interested and excited to see which heroes were present and what they were doing. Izuku looked at the cause of the explosions, and his minor excitement disintegrated in an instant. He could see the same green, the same murky, dirty sludge that had tried suffocating him minutes ago was trying to suffocate another person. But this time to Katsuki. He watched Katsuki struggle, pushing his arms out desperately and clawing at his mouth to remove the gunk that was forcing its way down his throat. He wanted to breath, but the sludge was not budging. Katsuki activated his quirk to try and attack the villain, but his arms were merely being puppeteered around. He thought All Might had captured the villain, but Izuku guesses the containment wasn't as good as the hero thought. Did the sludge villain escape? How did they achieve that? And where was All Might now? Surely, he'd realized that the villain had escaped, but why had he not arrived already? Would he even be here? Did All Might lose his strength after Izuku made him waste it when he clutched onto his leg? Izuku paused at the revelation that dawned on him. He was the cause of this, He was the reason Katsuki was dying right now. Izuku looked around at the heroes that were present at the scene. He wanted to know that the pros could fix his mistake. Backdraft was blocking the civilians and reporters from getting closer to the commotion, but nothing. Why were the fires not put out? Why wasn't he trying to dilute the villain? Buildings were burning down, and Katsuki was dying, yet Backdraft was doing nothing to stop it. Death Arms was focused on moving the civilians away from the villain and explosions. Izuku couldn't help but question why he wasn't doing anything either. His strength quirk would do little to the sludge directly, but he could at least offer assistance. For example, the sludge villain's eyes, they were the one solid part of the body. Wouldn't be enough to solely rely on defeating the villain, but it would cause serious damage, nonetheless. Then Kimui Woods, he could do what Death Arms could do and more. Grab materials and bring them in to cover the villain. Or loop his wood around the sludge so he could yank Katsuki out. It wouldn't defeat the sludge villain, but they would remove the hostage and Katsuki would be safe. But they were not doing any of that. He saw Kimui Woods grumble after one of his attacks, doing nothing to the sludge of the villain yet again. He sighed and made his way over to Death Arms and whispered to the other hero. Izuku was close enough that he could hear their short conversion of words, and he watched the wooden man lean in close to Death Arms. "We have to wait for backup. My quirk isn't suited for this fight," Kimui Woods said. Fight. All they had to do was rescue Katsuki, but they weren't even trying. Izuku is also fairly sure that Backdraft could defeat the villain on his own by diluting the sludge, but the villain hasn't even attempted to see if he could. Izuku tensed and clutched his fists. Why weren't they saving Katsuki? There were so many ways they could at least attempt at doing so. For the heroes to just stand around and wait for better-suited heroes was just wasting time, and judging by Katsuki's face turning red, they didn't have a lot left. Izuku looked around and saw no other hero coming. No one was coming to save Katsuki. If the team died, it would be all Izuku's fault. Izuku could see him struggling, glaring at the heroes angrily. But Izuku could see the desperation and fear in his eyes. He was losing consciousness. His movements and muffled screaming were lowering in intensity. Izuku looked at him hopelessly. He was dying. Then their eyes met. Izuku could see tears in them, something Izuku had never seen the boy have, even when they were kids. He was just so tough and awesome. He wasn't a weak cry-baby like Izuku. Katsuki wasn't a Deku. Izuku gritted his teeth. He would not let Katsuki die. Izuku would not allow Katsuki to die from his stupid actions. So Izuku made the brash decision to act on his own accord. Izuku ducked underneath the water barrier and sprinted towards Katsuki. He heard the heroes behind him yell at him to stop and return, but Izuku did not listen. They weren't helping Katsuki. They weren't saving him. His life is far more valuable than Izuku's ever would be. So, if he could at least trade his place, he'd happily do it. The sludge villain noticed Izuku racing towards him and growled. Sludge dripped down to cover parts of the villain's eyes, and his view narrowed at Izuku. He obviously recognized the boy's bright bushy green hair, but Izuku paid no mind to them. The sludge's evil smirk turned into a scowl. "Oh, it's you again. I'll unalive you," the villain spat. Its slimy tendrils bent down towards Izuku. He looked up at him and slightly panicked at the attack. Izuku didn't have a plan. He just ran in without a second thought. But he powered through and avoided one of the tendrils. Izuku looked back up to the looming threat of the sludge villain and could see that they wanted to unalive him. His red eyes glared down at him as Izuku got closer. His eyes. Izuku realized as the answer struck him, they were his weak points. If Izuku could hit him in the eyes, then maybe it would give him enough time to pull Katsuki out. Izuku dipped down to avoid more slime that traveled towards him but started to fall back. Izuku placed his hand behind his back and grabbed his school bag. Izuku jumped to the side to avoid another tendril. Izuku whipped his bag around and prepared to strike the villain with it. However, they were too tall. The villain was far out of Izuku's reach, but he still had things of use on him. Izuku pulled his bag out in front of him and reached for one of his zippers. But then he felt his foot squeeze and become constricted. Looking down, Izuku's eyes widened when he saw that it was sludge drenching his foot. Izuku squeaked when he jolted forward, the sludge pulling Izuku with it, but Izuku stayed standing. He squeezed his eyes shut and started swinging his bag in circles. He no longer had time to grab an item. He just had to throw his bag at the villain at once. Izuku yelled as he threw his bag up, the yellow backpack slamming into the villain's eyes. The sludge roared and let go of Izuku's foot, withdrawing in pain. This gave Izuku time to run forward towards Katsuki. He looked to where Katsuki was and saw his upper body shoot out from the sludge. Katsuki gasped for breath. His purple face regained color as he could finally breathe again. Izuku didn't skip a beat, and he sprinted towards Katsuki. Izuku extended his hand forward and snatched Katsuki's wrist, and with all of his might, Izuku leaned back and started pulling. Katsuki looked down at his hand as he felt someone grab him. His eyes traveled up the arm, before widening at the sight of Izuku. "Deku, what are you doing?" he shouted at him. Izuku growled and bit his lower lip and continued to pull with everything he had. Izuku got down on the ground, using the combination of his weight, might, and environment to receive any kind of leverage to assist in yanking Katsuki out from the sludge villain's wet hold. Izuku cracked an eye open and looked at Katsuki's angry red eyes. Katsuki had now used his second hand to grab onto Izuku and was using his own strength to pry himself out of the sludge. "I couldn't let you die," Izuku answered with a strained voice. Izuku could feel the hold that the villain had on Katsuki weaken as less of Katsuki was submerged in the sludge. Izuku yelled out, using the rest of his strength to pull Katsuki to safety. He pulled his head back and stomped his feet on the ground and drove his body away from the sludge to rip Katsuki to safety. With a wet plop, Katsuki flew over Izuku, his body hitting the cement toed hard. Izuku quickly scrambled over to Katsuki and started hauling the other onto his feet despite Izuku being on his knees himself. Izuku started pushing Katsuki away, using the little strength he had remaining to save Katsuki. But luckily, he didn't have to. "Never fear, for I am here." All Might's voice boomed. A loud chorus of cheers could be heard screaming loudly at All Might's arrival. Izuku and Katsuki didn't even have a chance to see the hero as he flew over the two boys to the villain. A gust of wind pushed the two teenagers towards the crowd of bystanders and other heroes, and they rolled across the ground. Izuku and Katsuki weakly pushed themselves up from the floor and looked over to the villain, except the villain had been defeated. His body had spread across the entire alleyway, now covering most of the walls with a dirty goop. All Might was in front of it, his body steaming, and he was panting heavily. Izuku looked at the hero shocked. He surprised he was there in the first place despite exceeding his limit. The hero had turned his head slightly so Izuku could see one of his glowing blue eyes. There was an expression on All Might's and Izuku gulped at seeing it. He couldn't tell what it was, but Izuku looked away. Just looking at his former idol just tore more of his heart apart, bringing tears back up into Izuku's eyes. Izuku looked back at Katsuki to see him panting, then the voices of the heroes coming closer. They both turned and saw Kimui Woods and Death Arms running towards them, helping with the teen's delirium. They noticed paramedics rushing over to them as well. Shakily, Izuku got to his feet. His mind was too blank to think. Katsuki tried getting up, but held his chest tight with one hand and breathed deeply, his lungs trying to make up for the lack of oxygen he was experiencing earlier. Izuku did hear All Might jump away, but he didn't turn to look. He was probably going somewhere to detransform. The heroes and paramedics directed Izuku and Katsuki away separately to get treated. The crowd and others were praising Katsuki on his bravery, with many commenting on his powerful quirk. However, no one was speaking to Izuku. Only the paramedics who spoke to him sweetly and helped him heal the minor injuries he had. Izuku then heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see both Kimui Woods and Death Arms looking at him angrily. "That was reckless, kid. Very stupid," Death Arms said sternly. Izuku looked back down. He felt his eyes welling up with tears again, but he wouldn't let them see. "Do you have a death wish, kid?" Kimui Woods asked me angrily. Izuku gritted his teeth but ignored the heroes again. He clenched his fist tight as the two continued about how stupid Izuku was. He already knew all of this, knew that he was worthless and a waste of time and space. But they weren't doing anything. Katsuki was going to die, and it was going to be all his fault. But then a thought came into Izuku's mind. Despite being the reason Katsuki almost died in the first place, he did save Katsuki. He could see the boy being close to losing consciousness, and as soon as he did, it would have been all over for his childhood friend. He saved Katsuki Bakugo, the boy with the great promise of one day being the #1 hero. Izuku still looked down and away from the heroes, but smiled. Izuku Midoriya had saved a life. It was a small feeling of what it would feel like to be a hero, and Izuku couldn't help the smile that was spreading across his face. The rush, the sensation of success, and knowing a quirkless nothing had rescued a person. Izuku couldn't stop his rapidly beating heart as the excitement of the memory kept his mind awake. Izuku knew he should stop trying to be a hero. It was pointless to try. But after getting a taste of what it was like, Izuku didn't think he could live without it. His heart could only beat as long as his dream was still alive. So Izuku now was ignoring what his mother had said, what his teachers and classmates had told him, as well as the threats Katsuki would give him. Izuku would ignore the advice and statement All Might had given him. Izuku will only stop trying to be a hero once his heart stops. Izuku woke the next morning on a weekend. He was relieved at that fact, but it still didn't stop his muscles from aching any less. Yesterday was still a reminder on his body and mind. A day that is now a memory that will forever be in Izuku's head no matter how much Izuku would love to forget it. Izuku got out of bed, which took more effort than what one would think. Izuku didn't have the energy to move a muscle, but he forced himself up so his mother wouldn't worry. He grumbled and walked into the kitchen with a limp in his step. Izuku's raised an eyebrow when he saw a piece of paper with his mother's credit card resting over it. Izuku moved closer to it. In one hand, he is holding the card, and another hand holding the piece of paper. There was writing on it, and Izuku knew it as his mother's handwriting. The note read, "Sorry, honey. I got called into work early today. I left my card so you can do some shopping because we're low on food at the moment. I hope you have a good day, sweetie. Love you." Izuku at first frowned at the letter because if he had known his mother was out, he wouldn't have gotten out of bed. However, it was good that he was up and walking around. Besides, he did need to do shopping like his mother had asked. So Izuku put the note down and placed the card back on top for later. He then walked over to cabinets in the kitchen and pulled them open. Izuku grabbed himself some breakfast. He got some American cereal called Captain Crunch and poured some milk into his bowl after dumping the contents from the cereal box moments prior into the bowl. He ate it slowly, allowing him to revel and relax. His emotions were currently sky-high right now, and he needed to take the time to think before he went out shopping. Soon Izuku finished his breakfast. He got up and groggily walked towards the sink. He washed out his bowl with water and a sponge before drying it with a hand towel. Izuku then placed the bowl back into the cupboard before making his way back to his room. Izuku closed the door behind him before waddling towards his bed. Izuku picked up the covers of his bed before stopping. Should he go back into bed? Izuku was very tempted to do so. Close his eyes and experience bliss of not existing for another couple of hours. But how long will those hours be? Izuku did need to go shopping eventually. It wasn't going to be now as Izuku has just woken up, but at least by midday. Izuku guessed his mom would be home around the early afternoon if she got called to work this morning. Izuku sighed as he decided that he would at least be productive. He let go of his quilt and moved towards his desk. Izuku stalled as his eyes landed on the All Might action figure he keeps on his desk. Izuku huffs and reaches his arm forward and pushed it to the side of his desk to keep it away from him when he sat down. Izuku then pulled his laptop out in front of him and opened the lid. Izuku went into Google and searched up Hero News. Hero News is entire segments and articles made specifically on heroes. There are so many of them, so it isn't hard to get a story. Izuku then reached over for his bag to grab his book, but it wasn't in there. Izuku wrinkled his nose as he shoved things to the side to double-check if it was in there. Izuku frowned and picked out the piece of paper All Might gifted him yesterday with his signature. Izuku knew he should be grateful to even have something like this, but Izuku couldn't bring himself to find joy while he looked at it. Then Izuku finally remembered that he threw his book in the bin yesterday after Katsuki destroyed it. Izuku sighed and slumped in his chair. He flicked the piece of paper towards his All Might action figure and lands at the figurine's feet. Izuku turns and looks at his computer screen, unsure of what to do now. He didn't find a point to scroll through Hero News without his Hero Analyses book. So now Izuku blankly stared at his computer screen. He pursed his lips and thought about what he should do now. He wondered if should just watch YouTube to pass the time. But he knew most of his feed would be All Might, and he wasn't someone Izuku wanted to see at the moment. Izuku grunted in frustration as memories of yesterday resurfaced. However, at those memories, something sparked in Izuku's mind. Izuku began to look thoughtfully at his computer before pushing himself up straight on his chair to correct his posture. Izuku leaned forward with his fingers spread out. Izuku moved his cursor towards the search bar and started to type. Could someone without a quirk become a hero? Izuku searched up that sentence, and an immediate answer popped up in big black letters. No. Izuku felt a jab at his heart, but he shook off the emotional pain. The result shouldn't have surprised him. Of course, someone like Deku could never be a hero. Despite this, Izuku wanted to at least look up more, to see if there were other close paths quirkless people could take to become a hero. Unfortunately, no answer came up. Not because there wasn't a solution, but because all Izuku could find was mockery and cruel sentences berating the quirkless, saying that they were inhuman and either become slaves for those with quirks or just die. Izuku didn't know what to think of those comments made by scientists or influencers. Izuku knew people didn't see him as human. While Izuku agreed, he was less valuable compared to another person who possessed a quirk, but he was still human. He could talk, walk on two legs, and learn like everybody else. He was just weaker, stupider, and useless. He knew quirkless people weren't always worse than those with quirks. An example is that he knows of a brilliant quirkless girl named Melissa Shield from America. She was the same age as Izuku himself, but unlike him, she was a genius. Despite being 14, Melissa is employed by her father at Shield Industries, and she has helped develop hero gear and made costumes for high-ranking heroes. Clearly by her success, not all quirkless people are useless. It just so happens that Deku is pathetic and worthless. Perhaps I should phrase the question differently, Izuku thought. Izuku reached for his keyboard once again and began to type a different question. One where the bias of someone's quirkless status didn't affect what people said. Sure, having a strong quirk helped a person get into heroics, but Izuku knows it is much more than that. If the hero is reckless and lacked skill, they'd be ineffective as a hero, no matter how strong they could potentially be. Conversely, a weak quirk could become heroic if the user was creative enough or adept at using their abilities to create advantages for themselves against villains. The pro-hero Mandalay was a prime example of this. Her quirk Telepath had zero combat potential, yet she is tied 411th rank along with her hero group, the Wild Pussycats. She had years of combat experience and was a great leader, able to issue commands to others even without the ability to see them. She's even developed a way to use her quirk to distract opponents, allowing her to take surprise. Izuku's fingers moved with lightning precision across his keyboard. He was an amazingly fast typer. Izuku then pressed enter and waited for the new page to load to hopefully have a better answer to his previous question. What can you do if you can't be a hero? Izuku typed. It took a couple of seconds before the page actually loaded. The top links and results were all just videos or inspirational articles saying that anyone could be a hero. Izuku smiled sadly and shook his head knowing that they were just lies. If you don't have a good enough quirk, you will be biased into not being a hero. Izuku scrolled down to about halfway into the results until he found something that looked like what he was actually looking for. He clicked on the link, and it brought him to Hero Forums, a place where people could ask a question on heroes and others answer it. The question was what this guy should do after failing to get into a hero school. Well, Izuku actually hasn't attempted the exam yet for UA or others with her, but knowing his luck and abilities, he'd inevitably fail. But the rest of the questions still applied to him. Izuku scrolled down the comments and found most of them just being condolences or suggesting the guy go see the school counselor. Izuku immediately dismissed the idea for him. Their guidance counselor had said he was a lost cause from the very beginning and would never amount to anything, obviously because of his quirkless status. Izuku continued to scroll down the comments and saw that someone said that if they still want to help people, being a doctor or police officer were still respectable jobs. All Might had recommended him to try being a doctor or police officer, but Izuku knows that they won't work for him. Not many officers would be keen on having a quirkless nobody like him amongst their ranks, and Izuku believes he is too dumb to even try and become a doctor. Izuku scrolled down a bit more, and his eyes naturally wandered down to the lower area of the screen with it. Izuku's eyes shot wide as he looked at the time, 12:48. Izuku was perplexed at when it got that late in the day, although he never had checked the time before then. Izuku started to panic as he still needed to go shopping for the day. Izuku jumped out of his chair, knocking to the ground. He ran to his closet and grabbed out acceptable clothing to wear in public. He flung his current clothes onto the ground before putting his new ones on. Izuku then ran out of his room and bolted for the door. He slid his shoes on when he reached the mat next to his door, and once they were on his feet, Izuku turned the knob to his front door and took a step outside. Izuku paused once he did this before he slammed the door shut and ran back inside. He ran into his room and grabbed his phone, just in case his mother called him before he ran into the kitchen to grab his mom's card. As soon as both of those items were in Izuku's pockets, he ran out the door to his house and closed it behind him. Izuku was now back on the streets as he made a brisk jog towards the shops. Izuku had wanted to go Musufatsu Shopping Central, the largest shopping center filled with an assortment of different shops, clothing stores, game shops, and also the biggest food center in the city, West Rations. West Rations is the food shop Izuku usually goes to. The shop has tons of food specifically from the West Coast, and Izuku has been addicted to what they have. However, Izuku didn't feel like he had time anymore to go to West Rations, so he decided to visit a more local food store. Izuku walked into the shop, passing the door sensors. He grabbed a basket and now weaved through the aisles, keeping his head down in order to not accidentally draw any attention to himself. Izuku needed to get himself some things to eat for lunch and wondered what he should get for dinner. It took Izuku just mere moments until a certain food popped into his head, katsudon, his favorite dish. He hoped his mother would willing to make some katsudon for him. Izuku had tried to make it himself before several times, but it always paled in comparison to when his mom made it. Izuku just hoped he wasn't being too selfish to ask that of his mom. Izuku filled his basket and made his way to the self-checkout. On his way, he passed by a shelf full of thick books. They caught Izuku's attention, and he stopped to look at them for a moment. Curious, he reached his hand towards one and opened the pages. They were completely blank except for the first 2 pages that had an empty index. Izuku's eyes shone brightly as he shoved the book into his basket. He needed a new hero analysis book. Izuku waited for a little in the self-checkout line, and it was his turn. He quickly scanned the items quickly. He was in a rush to get back home before his mom returned home. He didn't want her to think that he was lazing around all day. Izuku paid for some plastic bags to put his food in as he had forgotten to get his own bags when he ran out of his home. Izuku left the local shopping center and started walking home. He tried running with the bags, but it didn't feel comfortable. He just hoped his slower pace wouldn't cost him the time he needed to get back home before his mother. Izuku strolled down the cement path, moving out of his way from other pedestrians on their walk. He could hear the buzzing of people walking beside him and the white noise of their conversations. Izuku tried to tune it all out, but his hearing was perceptive, something that had adapted over years of listening to Katsuki's thundering stomps down the Aldera halls. "That's a villain," someone yelled, and Izuku's head whipped around. He expected to see a villain on the street, but all he saw were citizens continuing with their casual stroll. Izuku was confused. Had they not heard that shout, or was Izuku's mind playing tricks on him? Not a moment later, Izuku had his answer. The building he was standing directly in front of combusted into flames. The 4th floor of the building exploded with waves of fire and smoke rushing out from it. Bystanders on the street screamed in fear and ran away from explosion. Izuku did as well and immediately started running away. Izuku moved his head back to look at the mayhem that was happening and gasped at what he saw. The building that started shooting out fire had their walls exploding outwards to the 2 buildings next to it. Luckily, not much damage was occurring outward to the filled road in front of the falling architecture. Izuku could see the hero slingshot spout web from in between his fingertips at the building. The hero swung around the building, using his webs like a grappling hook, and kept the building secure in place to prevent it from falling onto the surrounding buildings. It looked like a cocoon from a spider was constricting the building in place and preventing it from falling over. The only problem was that parts of the web were beginning to burn. Izuku watched as more heroes arrived on the scene and looked over as they began to formulate a plan. Izuku hadn't even seen the villain but could tell that they had an explosion-type quirk judging by the continued noise inside of the burning cocoon. Izuku hadn't realized his running had stopped. He only noticed when the shouts from the world reached his ears once again. Izuku looked towards the pros, and he leaned forward to hear into their conversation. Izuku could also hear others shouting at him to get back, but he didn't listen as he was too focused on the heroes. There are still people inside we need to get out. They don't have much time, one of the heroes stated. I can create a web for them to jump into, Slingshot offered, producing some web to prove his point. Izuku hummed at their words, but something else was leaking into his ears. The voice was much quieter and sound feminine, and none of the heroes were girls. Izuku looked around, trying to spot who was speaking because he could make it out to be words, just not what they were saying. Help, Izuku managed to make out. His eyes widened, and his vision traveled towards the collapsing building. Looking up near the top, he could see a young girl on the ledge of the window. Izuku's eyes widened. She was coughing from the smoke, and his yells kept on being muffled. He looked towards the heroes, and it was clear that they didn't hear her desperate pleas. Izuku looked back towards the girl in worry and hopelessness. He wanted to help her, but he didn't know how. He could see her struggling and could only watch her tears roll down her pain-ridden face. Izuku couldn't take his eyes away from her as his mind shouted at him to save her, but he couldn't find a way to how. He couldn't do anything to help because he was a nothing. Izuku gulped and tried to press those thoughts down, but he knew they were true. He was pathetic, a loser and a good-for-nothing that will never dream of being more than just quirkless. The girl pressed down on the ledge, waving the smoke from her face as she continued to call out for help. But to her surprise, the ledge she was pressing against crumbled. She gasped and looked down at the ledge. She watched as it shifted before it shot out from under her. The girl screamed, her voice still raspy but finally loud enough for the heroes to hear. They were shocked and panicked to see a small girl plummet from their building. None of them were close enough to catch her, and she was moving too fast for Slingshot to save her. The heroes were about to watch a young girl lose her life because they didn't pay attention to her cries for help. The girl squeezed her eyes shut and curled herself into a ball. She braced herself for impact as she dropped to the ground. The girl grunted as she made contact, but it felt softer than what she had thought. The girl heard a groan of pain and opened her eyes confused. At first, she didn't see anything, but then she squeaked with surprise. Arms wrapped around her, and she was pulled into the air. Looking up, the girl could see a young teen boy with frilly green hair, holding her in his arms. Izuku had been fixated on the young girl, and as soon as he saw the ledge beneath her crack, he sprang into action. He sprinted towards the building, dropping his shopping bags where he just stood. He didn't remove his gaze from the falling girl, and his body seemed to move faster at hearing her shriek of terror. Izuku managed to get underneath her and catch her with his arms and chest. However, the force knocked Izuku onto the ground, slamming on his back. Izuku groaned at the force, but shook himself from the pain. He was still in fight or flight mode, and his body was filled with adrenaline at the moment. Izuku pushed himself back up onto his 2 feet, taking the young girl with him, and ran towards the crowd of people. The bystanders shouted at the boy, a woman coming out to help the boy. She took the child out of Izuku's arms, but the young girl kept her eyes on her savior. "Are you all right?" the woman asked. However, Izuku was too shocked to answer. Everything was happening far too fast for Izuku's feeble mind to comprehend. He had just run straight into danger, for the second time in just 2 days. He rescued a falling girl and made a mad dash away from the exploding building. It took a while for Izuku's head to clear, and once he did, the first thing that shot into his head was, "Crap, the shopping." Izuku turned around and sprinted back over to his shopping bags. The people of the crowd were shocked and shouted at him to come back. Izuku, however, was too much in a panic. He needed to get home before his mother did, and if he forgot the shopping, he'd never hear the end of it. Izuku picked up the plastic handles the bag had before turning around and running back to the crowd. They tried to stop him, they wanted to talk to him, but Izuku didn't care, he just wanted to get home. Izuku moved past the people, ignoring their protests as they yelled at him to stop. Izuku managed to make it past them before running his way back home. However, he heard one thing before he made his getaway. "Thank you, mister," a young female voice shouted. Izuku sighed as he closed the door to his house with his foot. His mother wasn't here yet, and he arrived with the shopping in one piece. Izuku walked over to the kitchen counter and plopped the bags of shopping onto the counter. He then started to pull all of the food out and put it away. "Didn't expect that to happen today," Izuku said out loud, reminiscing on the fact he was involved with 2 villain attacks in back-to-back days. Technically 3 if you count when he first met All Might. A smile blossomed onto Izuku's face as he put the items away. Not only had he prevented Katsuki from perishing at the hands of a villain, He rescued a young girl from falling to her death. Izuku couldn't help his giddy laugh that escaped his lips. The feeling of utter bliss overtook his emotions as he remembered saving those two people. The dark voice in his head told him that anyone could have saved them, but Izuku didn't care at the moment. Whether another person could have saved them didn't matter to Izuku. No one was going to. If Izuku hadn't stepped in, they would have died, and the feeling of being a hero almost brought happy tears to the Greenette's eyes. Izuku kept his blissful smile as he walked back into his room. He shut the door behind him and placed a hand on his rapidly beating heart. He felt guilty that he was happy that 2 villain attacks happened, but he couldn't help it. He felt what it was like to be a hero, and Izuku couldn't help but revel in this feeling as he knew it may be his only time. He could feel what it was like. Izuku sat down on his chair and turned his computer back on, but was surprised to see he already had an open tab on his computer. Izuku then face-palmed himself as he remembered that he didn't shut his computer down before leaving the house. Izuku sighed. His smile washed off of his face and now was filled with disappointment in himself. Izuku saw that it was still on the forum he was looking at before he ran out. The question of what someone should do if they failed to become a hero. Izuku's eyes ran from the top of the current comment on the screen, his mind on autopilot as he read the recommendations and condolences. But his eyes latched onto something at the very bottom, part of the message cut off by his screen, but the letters were still clearly legible. Izuku raised his eyebrow and leaned forward in his seat. Just don't become a vigilante, it never works for anyone. Izuku blinked. Vigilante? He's only heard that word a couple of times in the past. They were people who took the law into their own hands and acted against villains. It was illegal, so Izuku understood what the commenter meant. It was a bad idea for anyone to try and become a vigilante. If they could defeat villains, they should just try to become a hero in a different and legitimate way. Izuku then tried to rid himself of the thoughts on vigilantes, and he scrolled further down the forum. However, he admitted defeat and opened a new tab to look up vigilantes. Izuku had a curious mind, and he constantly asked questions because he was stupid, so Izuku needed proper confirmation on why being a vigilante would be a bad idea. Izuku looked up vigilantes and clicked the first articles. Most vigilantes don't make it past 2 months of vigilantism. Only 4 recorded vigilantes in Japan have ever been active for more than a year. Those 4 being Knuckleduster, Crawler, Pop Step, and Stendhal. Knuckleduster and Stendhal were independent for a while. The previous 2 had been documented to almost always be working with a partner. Stendhal had unexplainably disappeared, and Knuckleduster became the mentor for Pop Step and the Crawler before they were finally detained and taken into custody. Izuku intently scrolled through the article, clicking on links that would lead to more matters of vigilantes, but mainly kept his focus on the 4 that survived for longer than a year. But a comment caught his eye. It was on an article about Knuckleduster, and the comment was written by the author themselves with the obvious intention of hoping people wouldn't read it. But Izuku had seen it, and his eyes widened. Knuckleduster has never displayed the use of a quirk. The general theory is that he has a strength enhancement quirk, but looking at his feats, it's obvious that someone without a quirk could also perform them. Although his quirk is a mystery and likely has one, it can be said that he may not use it, at least often. So, he may fight quirkless as his quirk has no ability to assist in combat. Izuku was in shock as he read that comment. Knuckleduster, arguably the best vigilante in Japan in terms of defeating criminals, fights quirkless? It is just a theory, but they don't have any evidence of a quirk usage at all for the man. Izuku read it again to check if he wasn't misunderstanding anything as he was an idiot, but found that it said what he thought it said. Curious, Izuku decided to check the official vigilantism law. Opening up a new tab, Izuku quickly searched it up. Vigilantism is the act of someone using their quirk for heroic actions without a license. Izuku read it again. The act of using their quirk for heroic actions. Quirk, a quirk. Knuckleduster never displayed use of a quirk, so he may have bypassed the law. Obviously, acts of assault would still be used, but if the instance is able to be claimed as self-defense, the crime can be overlooked. However, Izuku doubts the man wouldn't have been arrested. He has beaten villains close to death several times and used unauthorized weapons. His weapon was literally his name. Wait, could Izuku be a vigilante? He didn't have a quirk, so he would be a loophole to the law. If he never initiated the attack, He could always claim self-defense, which would be easy to do if he was defending somebody. As long as he didn't use an illegal weapon, such as a knife, Izuku couldn't get booked for a crime. Would being a vigilante be bad? By looking at the comments of government articles, they are really trying to paint them as evil. It makes sense, they are breaking the law. A lot of the vigilantes are egotistical brats who believe that they should be an official hero after they were expelled or dropped from any hero course. But some of them, like the crawler, were just in it to help innocent people. Some vigilantes actually did better than certified heroes. Izuku shook himself from the idea. He was just a stupid Deku. He couldn't save anybody. But the memory of helping the young girl and saving Katsuki popped back into his head. An immediate smile sprung on his lips. Izuku shook his head and slapped his cheeks, trying to the full picture. But he couldn't. If he was a vigilante, he could potentially save someone again. He wouldn't be recognized as a hero, but Izuku was all right with that. He just wanted to know how it felt like to be a hero because that was a dream Izuku would never be able to accomplish. Izuku's heart became lighter, and a mix of fear and excitement coursed through his body. He had gotten a taste of what heroism was like. Izuku wanted to taste it again. No, he needed the sensation of saving someone one more time. He wanted to feel proud and believe that he wasn't burden or a waste of space despite knowing he was. Anything to lie to himself about reality and feel useful for once in his life. Izuku gave out a breathless laugh and looked at his computer screen determinedly. He made up his mind. He was going to be a vigilante. Obviously, Izuku wasn't just going to rush out into the streets. He was dumb, but not needlessly stupid. He needed a plan. Izuku grinned as he brought up a new tab and did research into how some vigilantes lasted as long as they did. Izuku hoped this wouldn't end in complete failure. He needed to save at least one more person in his miserable life. Besides, even if he couldn't, he could always take Katsuki's advice. So, this was the end of part 1 of this series. Stay tuned for next part of this series, and if you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Until next time.